Hi everyone. So the title of my video today is Intro to Fountain Pens as Drawing Tools. When I was in college, I used to use dip pens, and I have never been the most neat or precise, I guess, person in the world. I mean, like, really, if you want to get technical about it, you could just call me clumsy and have done with it, because that would probably be more accurate. But when I would use these dip pens in college, I'd be like halfway done with a really intricate, detailed drawing that had taken me like 3 hours to do. And all of a sudden, like, I'd catch the nib on some little tiny bit of something on the paper, and ink would like spatter across the paper and wreck the drawing. And, you know, it would result in some bad language and some frustration and all these kinds of things. And then there was the other thing that I used to do once in a while, which is like just knock over the ink bottle, which was like, because you had to leave it open to continuously dip the pen into it. And that was always a disaster, and it resulted in a mess, and I had to clean it up in front of the other students, and it was mortifying and embarrassing and all that. But now I have a different way, and that way is the fountain pen. And I wish that our professors had told us about these in school, but no. They were probably like, isn't that funny? She just wrecked her drawing by knocking over the ink again. You know, like, I mean, probably not, but it's definitely, I mean, I had one of them compare me to a Saint Bernard once. That was probably because I knocked over an ink bottle. A Saint Bernard puppy, which is probably one of the clumsiest things on the planet. I didn't know whether to be complimented because Saint Bernards are cute, or like freaked out because, you know, I was probably never going to be able to accomplish anything that required grace. But anyway, so I discovered fountain pens, and it was a love affair at first sight, primarily because of this. And then my love affair got really crazy when I discovered this. This is Diatramentis Document Black ink. And it is a permanent ink that you can actually use in a fountain pen. So it's just like India ink. In fact, I did testing on both of these inks, and this is more permanent than the India ink, which is kind of amazing to me. But, so I can basically use my fountain pen in the same way that I would have used a dip pen in college. And depending on the kind of tip I like, I have a lot of choices there, just like I would with a dip pen when I was in college. So I really enjoy that. Anyway, I've talked about this ink before, and I plan on talking a little bit more about it because I find its qualities to be really unique and interesting. I'm sorry about the lighting. It is kind of odd because the sun keeps going under the clouds and then it comes out again, and you'll see the light dim and then brighten. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set this up so that I'll demonstrate each nib, and I'll demonstrate several different kinds of ink, and then I will paint over that ink with watercolor, and you're going to be able to see the different ways that inks with different characteristics work. That way, when you choose an ink, you're going to have some idea of what that's like when combined with watercolor. So I'm going to switch the camera angle, and we'll do that. Okay, so here are some samples of writing with some different kinds of pens, and writing can substitute for drawing here. I just wrote it to give you the information about the kind of ink I used as well, and I also wanted you to see what's going to happen to the ink when we go over it with some watercolor. It's a Waterman Filius fine point. And this ink is very nice to write with. The pen itself doesn't have much flexibility in the nib at all, which is okay. It gives you a certain kind of line. Not very interesting, I guess, but very precise. There, just got a little more water on the tip. All right. Now, this is what it's like when you go over a permanent ink with watercolor. I'm really puddling that water on there, and we're not getting any sort of bleeding of that ink. See? Going over that real good, all right? Now, let's see what happens if we go over the ink. This was sitting here for like 15 minutes. If we go over this right here that I just put down, no smearing. So, you really can watercolor over that without any concern whatsoever. Next, the next one we did is the Noodler's Heart of Darkness, and this is called a bulletproof ink, which means that you should be able to read this no matter what you put on it, but it might smear a little bit. So this is the pen I used is a Pelikan medium point. And this produces a lot of shading. And it's a Pelikan, I guess it's a 200 medium point. And this is almost a flex pen. Like it can go from being fairly narrow to a lot wider. I really don't know why it's graying out so much. There may have been some water trapped in it after the last cleaning. This Noodler's Heart of Darkness shouldn't be quite this gray, but let's see whether or not this smears. So we're going to use the same orange watercolor again. There's a fair amount of flex in that pen. There's some people like there's a lot of people on YouTube who really swear by the Pelikans, and for good reason. They're terrific pens. Okay, so let's see what happens when we do this over the bulletproof ink. All right, not much, but if we really were to scrub on this ink, you'd probably get a little bit of bleeding. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's doing it, so that's good. Yeah, there's a little smearing here around that period, and it did fade somewhat. So it's still great. And it gives you a certain look, but it might like kind of pick up from the paper a little bit. See, in Noodlers, you're getting some graying around the word. That's the difference between the bulletproof and the permanent. Now, permanent inks for fountain pens like this Diatramenis ink, this is the only brand I know that I would trust in a permanent fountain pen ink. I tried a Mont Blanc permanent blue, totally clogged a pen. Like it was a terrible disaster. But the Diatramenis, knock on wood, I have never clogged anything. I've never had anything go wrong with that. It's a great ink. So I recommend that unreservedly. I probably at this point would not use it in my antique or vintage flex nibs or antique or vintage pens in general, just because they are sack fill pens, most of them, and if it did get clogged, it would require replacing the sack. So it's just one extra step. Now this is Diamine Ancient Copper ink, and this is a washable ink. Let's see what happens when we go over a washable ink with watercolor. It's water soluble, this ink. See, the ink is pretty much washing off the paper. Like, you can't really see it anymore. It's going away. It's just blending right into that orange. Like, if I had done it in a different color, like yellow, you would have been able to see that more. But it does. It just kind of goes away. That's what water-soluble means, and that's what water-soluble ink does. Here, for the Rouge Hematite, I'll use a kind of a dark yellow in it, over it, maybe a little bit of orange there. That'll be like, you'll be able to see this come off more. So this is the Rouge Hematite. Beautiful ink, extremely water soluble, even more so than the Diamine Ancient Copper. Like if I kept going over this, it would be gone, right? So that's what the difference is between your bulletproof, your permanent, and your water-soluble inks in terms of art. So, I was going to introduce you to the two pens that I use to write those things, because that's important too. no sane collector of pens would buy this pen clipless and want to have, you know, you're not going to get much money out of it. Like, but I don't care, because the reason I got it is for this nib, which is 14 karat gold, and it's a flex nib, and it was fairly inexpensive, and it's a fantastic drawing tool. So I'm going to just dip this in a little bit of water because it's been sitting for a bit, but okay. So the diamine ancient copper is in a flex nib, and a flex nib, a full, that's a flex nib. So it provides you with lots of line variability. So if we go across like that, we can go from very light to heavier, to heavier, to heavier, heaviest. Okay, this is probably a semi-flex. They actually make nibs that are more flexible than this, but I really like this nib. And if you also, here's a warning, don't ever use water-soluble ink to draw over damp paper, because it bleeds into the paper. So you'll see in a minute where that's gonna just kind of start fading in, and it'll sort of blur. Now, the fourth kind of pen I use, this is a semi-flex. Okay, so this is, whoops, I forgot to tell you what this is. I think it's an Eclipse. From the 20s. And it is a 14K nib. Okay, so that's another option. And you have to know how to work on fountain pens a little bit to make this something that you can use without being very sad when the sack gets clogged or something like that. So you have to be able to be comfortable resacking your own pen, I feel, or you can live near a shop that will resack your pen, or you can send it away if you can bear to be without it, which I would be worried if I had to send my pen somewhere and wait for it to come back. That's principally the reason I learned to resack the pens. I'm like a mother hen to these things. I sort of hover over them, and, you know, I have to really love you to let you even play with them. You know, the vintage ones. These guys I don't get as twitchy about. So this is a TWSBI. .580. 1.1 millimeter stub nib. Now, I think that if you're going to use a fountain pen, and this is intro to drawing with fountain pens, you definitely might want to avoid the flex nib for starters, and you might want to avoid any kind of nib that calls itself an italic nib or a calligraphy nib. The reason I would say that is because they take a little bit of skill to use, and if you're introducing yourself to using fountain pens with drawing, unless you're an expert fountain pen user to start with, you might find an italic nib fairly frustrating, because they tend to have crisp edges on, like, the side of the nib here. This is called a stub nib because if you look very closely, you can see that the side edges of each of these points is curved. So that's why that's a stub nib. Now, if you were using an italic nib, that would be straight, which meant if your nib would catch on the paper, it could spatter, and it would just be more likely to catch on paper. So that might make it a frustrating experience for you. So if I were you, I would probably avoid italic nibs and instead select, if I wanted a broader line with some expression, I'd select something like this stub nib, because that, if you look at the writing on there, it gives you a fair amount of expressive line. Now, looking again at this, we watercolored over these. The Diatramentis Document Black, the lines are very crisp and elegant. The Noodler's Heart of Darkness, which is the bulletproof ink, is still readable, but you can see where the ink has kind of smeared into the watercolor and it's grayed out. The Diamine Ancient Copper has completely blended with the watercolor, as did the Rouge Hematite. So let's end this one, and please come back and check part 2 of the intro to fountain pens as drawing tools videos. Have a great day. Bye.